Martha hadn't looked at the clock yet, but she already knew. Her eyes snapped open like someone had whispered her name in the dark. Not groggy, not confused, just awake. A little too alert for comfort. She turned her head slowly, as if hoping the time might be different this time. 3:02. She sighed and shifted under the covers, the silence of her house pressing in around her like a second blanket. Outside, nothing moved. No cars, no wind, not even the creak of the old maple in the yard. Just that heavy stillness, the kind that made it feel like the rest of the world was still asleep, and only she had been plucked from time. This had been happening for almost a year now. At first, she chalked it up to age. Her sister Lillian, younger by 3 years and still annoyingly smug about her 8-hour nights, told her it was probably just hormones or needing to pee. But Martha didn't need the bathroom. She wasn't having hot flashes. And her mind wasn't racing either. She just woke up, always between 3 and 3:15. It had become so routine that she started keeping a journal on her nightstand. At first, it was just dates and times. But then she started recording how she felt when she woke. Tense stomach, cold feet, a weird flutter in her chest. Sometimes she noted dreams. Other times, a strange feeling of urgency, like she was supposed to do something. But what? Her doctor had brushed it off. It's common in older adults, he'd said, tapping a few notes into his tablet. Your sleep gets lighter. Try some chamomile tea before bed. Chamomile tea. That was the extent of it. But deep down, Martha felt something wasn't right. It wasn't just lighter sleep. This felt mechanical, predictable, like her body was running on a schedule she hadn't agreed to. And she wasn't alone. She started noticing that her neighbor, Saul, often turned on his porch light around the same time. A distant glow in the early morning fog. A month later, her friend Judy admitted she had also been waking up at 3 a.m. like clockwork, and just assumed it was her bladder or the dog. But the dog stayed asleep. That's when Martha began to wonder, what really happens to the body at 3 in the morning? Why would it choose that moment over and over to spring her from sleep? She didn't know it yet, but her body was whispering secrets in the dark, clues rooted in chemistry, rhythm, and memory. Clues she was finally ready to follow. Because the 3 a.m. wake-up call isn't random. It's a signal. And it's coming from deep inside. The forgotten organ that controls sleep. Martha had always thought of the brain as the master switch for sleep. Flip it on, you're awake. Flip it off, and down you go. But after her 3rd sleepless month, she discovered something she hadn't considered. Sleep wasn't controlled by a switch at all. It was ruled by a clock, and that clock might be broken. She first came across the term circadian rhythm in a book left behind at the library's community reading table. The pages were dog-eared and full of underlines. The book said every human being has an internal clock ticking away inside, telling the body when to eat, when to release hormones, and when to sleep. But with age, that clock doesn't just tick slower, it starts ticking out of sync. The master clock, it turns out, lives in a tiny part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's no larger than a grain of rice, but it governs nearly every biological rhythm in the body. And this little clock is powered by one thing: light. In younger people, bright morning light hits the eyes and resets this clock like winding a watch. But as people age, their eyes become less sensitive to light, especially the kind that comes from natural sunlight. The lens is yellow. Pupils shrink. Light doesn't reach the brain the way it used to. So the body begins to misread time. Melatonin, the hormone that makes you sleepy, starts rising too early, which causes many older adults to fall asleep before 10 p.m. But it also wears off too early. By the time the clock strikes 3, melatonin levels drop, and the brain mistakenly believes it's time to wake. Martha remembered how she used to walk every morning before sunrise. She'd catch the early light without even thinking about it. But after her arthritis got worse, those walks stopped. And so, perhaps, did her clock's daily reset. She decided to experiment. Each morning, just after waking, even at 3 a.m., she'd sit by the window and let the earliest light of dawn hit her face. She avoided artificial lights in the evening and turned off her TV by 8. She even ordered a small light therapy box, the kind used for winter blues, and used it as soon as the sun came up. She wasn't sure if it was helping yet, but she noticed something interesting. Her 3 a.m. wake-ups started creeping later. 3:15. Then 3:30. Some mornings she made it to 4. And in her journal, she wrote something she hadn't in months. "I almost feel like I'm sleeping again." What Martha didn't realize yet was that the clock inside her wasn't broken, just confused. And like any clock, it needed gentle, daily reminders of what time it truly was. But even with her internal rhythm slowly adjusting, something else was still disrupting her sleep. Something deeper. Something metabolic. And it lived in her blood. Your glucose levels could be waking you up. 3 weeks into her light therapy routine, Martha was hopeful. The early wake-ups hadn't vanished, but they'd softened. Less jarring. Less frequent. She could almost pretend it was coincidence, until the night she ate that slice of banana bread. It was homemade. Still warm from the oven. She hadn't had dessert in weeks, and one slice seemed harmless. She had it around 8, with a glass of milk, then went to bed feeling content. At exactly 3:09 a.m., her eyes flew open. Wide awake. Jittery. Her heart beat faster than usual, and her chest felt hollow, like something had dropped out of it. It was the worst night in a while. The next morning, she turned to her journal. The entry was short, but her handwriting had a certain edge to it. Banana bread. Felt shaky. Cold hands. Definitely awake. That's when she started researching blood sugar. What she learned startled her. In older adults, blood glucose regulation weakens, even in those who've never had diabetes. After a carb-heavy evening meal or sugary dessert, blood sugar spikes temporarily, then crashes several hours later. That crash often happens right around 3 a.m. And when blood sugar dips too low during sleep, the body panics. To correct the drop, it releases cortisol and adrenaline, stress hormones meant to jolt the liver into dumping stored sugar back into the bloodstream. But those same hormones also wake you up. Suddenly. Sometimes with a racing heart. Sometimes with a wave of anxiety. Sometimes, like Martha, with no obvious reason at all. Doctors often miss this because the effect is subtle. It's not hypoglycemia in the clinical sense. It's subclinical glucose instability. And it can sabotage deep sleep for years before it ever shows up on a blood test. One study found that older adults with erratic glucose rhythms were more than twice as likely to report early morning awakenings. Another showed that even normal blood sugar ranges can hide nighttime instability if insulin sensitivity has declined, something common after age 65. Martha began tweaking her dinners. She started adding protein, a small piece of salmon, a boiled egg, even half an avocado. She avoided fruit or starchy carbs after 6 p.m. Some nights, she took a spoonful of almond butter before bed, just enough to stabilize blood sugar through the night. The difference was subtle, but it grew. Her 3 a.m. wake-ups began shifting again. 3:30. Then closer to 4. A few nights, she even slept past dawn. It wasn't a miracle. It was biology, working the way it should. And it made her wonder how many others like her were jolted awake every night, blaming age, stress, or habit, when the real culprit was floating silently in their blood. Still, even as Martha adjusted her diet, something else kept nagging at her. Some nights, she went to bed light, ate clean, managed her routine, and yet, awake again. Maybe it wasn't in her head, or her food. Maybe it was in her organs. Why your liver works overtime at night. There's a strange kind of silence that comes just before the liver speaks. Not in words, of course, but in symptoms. The dull restlessness. The tension just beneath the ribs. The feeling of being awake, but not fully sure why. Martha had begun to sense it. Despite dialing in her meals and light exposure, some nights still ended the same way, staring at the ceiling at 3:07 a.m., pulse steady but brain alert. It didn't feel like stress. It didn't feel like sugar. It felt organ deep. She stumbled on the connection one afternoon at the senior center's library. A slim, dog-eared book on holistic sleep mentioned something called the Chinese organ clock, an ancient system that claimed every major organ in the body had a peak repair time during the 24-hour cycle. According to this clock, the liver's repair window fell between 1 and 3 a.m. It sounded mystical, maybe even outdated, but what followed was harder to ignore. Modern science quietly confirmed that the liver performs critical metabolic functions during that exact time frame. And if those processes are compromised, due to age, medication, alcohol, or diet, they can create internal disruptions that wake the body up without warning. Here's how it works. Each night, the liver clears toxins, processes nutrients, and regulates blood sugar by releasing stored glucose into the bloodstream in small, controlled amounts. But in older adults, this process often becomes strained. Years of cumulative exposure to meds, fatty foods, alcohol, or even environmental pollutants can slow the liver down. When liver function is sluggish, one of two things happens. Either the liver fails to release glucose efficiently, causing a blood sugar dip and the classic 3 a.m. cortisol spike, or the liver becomes overstimulated, dumping too much sugar or adrenaline into the system, triggering alertness instead of rest. It's a delicate balance, and it's often invisible. Even certain medications taken before bed, like statins, sleep aids, or painkillers, may force the liver to work harder during its peak detox window. That internal struggle rarely feels like pain. It just feels like waking up. Martha looked back through her journal and noticed a pattern she'd missed. On nights when she ate heavier foods, cream-based soups, processed meats, or even a glass of red wine, her wake-ups returned. She'd assumed it was the food itself. But now, she saw the deeper pattern. Her liver was being asked to work overtime, and it didn't like the shift. She made subtle changes. Cut out wine. Reduced fatty dinners. Took her prescriptions earlier in the day. Even began sipping warm lemon water after meals. Not a miracle cure, but a small support for her overburdened detox engine. And slowly, the stillness of the house at 3 a.m. began to feel less threatening. Her body started sleeping a little deeper, staying asleep a little longer. The liver, she realized, was a quiet workhorse. But when neglected, it had a way of waking you to remind you it still matters. Still, one question lingered. Why, even when her body felt calm, did her mind still flicker awake some nights, like a light bulb with frayed wiring? It was time to look deeper, into stress, memory, and the hidden tension most seniors carry without even knowing it. When the body is calm, but the mind is not. Martha couldn't explain it. There were nights when she followed every rule. No sugar, no screens, no stress. She ate early, breathed deeply, even laid out her clothes for the next day. Her room was cool, dark, and quiet. And yet, at 3:11 a.m., she woke up. Not startled. Not shaken. Just wide-eyed. Aware. It wasn't a thought that woke her. It was a presence, a tension sitting just beneath the skin, as if her nervous system had been waiting for this moment all along. That's when her therapist, a gentle woman named Dana, mentioned a phrase she hadn't heard before: hyperarousal. It's a state in which the body looks calm, heart rate normal, muscles relaxed, but the nervous system is quietly buzzing, stuck in a state of low-grade vigilance. It's like the body's alarm system was never shut off. And it turns out older adults are especially vulnerable to this. Not because of trauma alone, but because aging itself brings layers of unprocessed stress. The grief of losing friends. The anxiety of medical tests. The fear of mental decline. Even long-ago emotions, buried deep, can start to rise in the quiet hours of the night. Research shows that in seniors, the cortisol rhythm, the body's daily pattern of stress hormone release, often gets disrupted. Instead of peaking in the morning as it should, cortisol may begin rising too early, around 2 or 3 a.m. This subtle hormonal surge doesn't always cause panic, but it does nudge the brain toward alertness. Sometimes, it surfaces as a racing thought. Other times, just an empty awareness. A feeling of being on when everything else is off. Martha began to wonder if her own body had been silently absorbing years of tension. After all, she'd never properly mourned her husband. She still kept his slippers by the door. She hadn't cried in years, not because she didn't feel, but because the world expected her to carry on. And so, her body did. Until the quiet hours when everything else stopped moving. That's when the whispers started, the ones she couldn't quite name, but always felt. Dana suggested she begin a night writing ritual, just 5 minutes before bed, where she let herself write whatever surfaced, uncensored. Some nights it was nonsense. Some nights it was memories. Some nights, confessions. But something began to shift. On the nights she wrote honestly, her sleep deepened. The 3 a.m. wake-up still came, but with less edge. And sometimes she drifted back down without even sitting up. Her nervous system, long stuck in standby mode, was learning to power down. What Martha had thought was insomnia wasn't just about her sleep. It was about her stillness. And how unpracticed she was in it. But even with her emotional burdens slowly unraveling, another culprit still lurked in her routine, a set of pills she'd never questioned, taken faithfully at night. And they were quietly keeping her locked in this cycle. The side effects you were never warned about. For as long as Martha could remember, she'd ended her evenings the same way, brushing her teeth, slipping into bed, and swallowing 2 pills with a sip of water from the glass on her nightstand. One was a beta blocker for her blood pressure. The other, a statin for cholesterol. She never questioned them. Her doctor prescribed them years ago, and they'd become part of the bedtime ritual. She assumed, like many do, that nighttime was the best time for meds. But one morning, while thumbing through an old AARP newsletter at the cafe, a single line caught her eye. Some medications suppress melatonin and can silently disrupt your sleep. That one sentence led her down a rabbit hole. What she found startled her. Many common medications prescribed to older adults interfere with the sleep cycle, either by altering hormone levels, disrupting neurotransmitters, or overstimulating the brain during rest. And the worst part? It often happens without any side effects during the day. Take beta blockers, for instance. They're life-saving drugs that help control blood pressure, but they also reduce the body's natural melatonin production. This matters more than most people realize. Melatonin isn't just a sleep aid, it's a clock regulator. A drop at the wrong time can throw the whole circadian rhythm out of sync. Statins, too, can cause muscle microcramping during sleep, even when the pain isn't strong enough to wake someone consciously. Instead, the discomfort shows up as light sleep, frequent tossing, or the eerie, "I just woke up again," at exactly 3 a.m. Even certain antidepressants and over-the-counter sleep aids, meant to help with rest, can disrupt the very architecture of sleep. Some suppress REM sleep, leaving the sleeper in lighter, more fragile stages where they're more likely to wake up at small internal cues like blood sugar shifts or minor stress hormones. Martha took her journal to her next doctor's visit and asked a simple question. Could these pills be messing with my sleep? Her doctor paused. Then, to his credit, nodded. They might be. Let's try switching the timing. He moved her statin and beta blocker to the morning, when their sleep-disruptive effects would be less intrusive. They also reviewed her full list of meds, including her calcium supplement, which contained a small dose of caffeine as a filler. She dropped that entirely. Within a week, her 3 a.m. wake-ups felt softer. Less jarring. More like rolling over than snapping awake. She realized something chilling. For years, she'd been told her sleep problems were part of aging. But in reality, part of the problem had been handed to her in a white prescription bottle. This didn't mean she didn't need the meds, only that the timing, the combination, and the lack of sleep-focused guidance had played a bigger role than anyone told her. Still, something else hovered around those early morning hours. Even when her sleep was better, she couldn't shake the sense that those 3 a.m. wake-ups meant something. That they weren't just a chemical accident, but a kind of message. She wasn't the only one who felt that way. Because for some, the hour between 3 and 4 a.m. isn't just inconvenient. It's sacred. Is something trying to tell you? Martha never considered herself a spiritual person. She believed in science, order, and facts that could be underlined in textbooks. But there was something about waking up at precisely 3:00-something every morning, again and again, that felt deliberate, not random, as if something deep inside her was knocking. She kept quiet about this at first, embarrassed by the thought. But during a quiet moment in her grief support group, an older man named Eli spoke up. "I keep waking up at 3:20, he said softly, staring into his coffee. "It's always the same. Like, something's trying to remind me of something." No one laughed. Another woman nodded. That's when my late husband passed. I didn't realize until weeks later that I'd been waking up around that time ever since. Someone else added, isn't that the hour they call the spiritual window? They all sat in silence for a moment, the kind that's not heavy, just full. Later that evening, curious, Martha searched the phrase, why do I keep waking up at 3 a.m.? What she found wasn't just medical. It was ancestral. Across cultures and centuries, the hour between 3 and 4 a.m. has been known by many names. The witching hour, the hour of the wolf, the spiritual veil. In ancient tradition, it was believed to be the time when the veil between the physical and spiritual world is thinnest. When intuition whispers louder. When unresolved grief, secrets, or truths try to rise. Even modern psychology has started to take note. Some researchers suggest the pre-dawn hours may act as a kind of emotional processing zone, a time when the brain, free from distractions, starts to surface deeper content from the subconscious. Nightmares, longing, forgotten memories. One theory even proposes that during early morning REM cycles, the mind attempts to reorganize emotional memory, especially in those over 60. If the emotional load is too heavy or left unprocessed, it can stir the sleeper awake. Martha had begun journaling again, but now, she paid attention to what she felt during those early hours. Sometimes it was restlessness. Other times, something more elusive. One morning, she scribbled just 2 words. My mother. She hadn't thought about her mother's passing in years. But that morning at 3:04 a.m., her dream had replayed an exact moment from her childhood, standing in the kitchen, holding her mother's hand, bathed in the golden light of dawn. It wasn't frightening. It was warm. And for the first time, she didn't mind being awake. This didn't mean the 3 a.m. wake-ups were always meaningful. Sometimes they were just biology, a sugar crash, a cortisol surge, a liver under stress. But every now and then, they were something else. A tap on the shoulder from a quieter part of the self. A message surfacing when the world was still. And when Martha began to listen without fear, something softened in her. Her body, no longer fighting the wakefulness, began to settle more easily. She started falling back asleep, not because the 3 a.m. hour had vanished, but because it no longer needed to hold her there. Still, there were practical steps to take. Rituals that could bring the body and mind back into rhythm, not just for Martha, but for anyone whose nights had been fractured by the mystery of early waking. Because while the cause may be hidden, the path forward is clearer than it seems. How to finally sleep through 3 a.m. Martha stood by the window one morning, wrapped in her robe, holding a cup of chamomile she no longer needed. The sky was pale blue, the birds just beginning their song. And for the first time in over a year, she'd slept through the entire night. No sudden jolt at 3:04. No unease in her chest. Just quiet. Just rest. The solution, it turned out, hadn't come from a single change, but from many small ones. And none of them were dramatic. No pills. No overhauls. Just a gentle rebalancing of what time, age, and habit had slowly unraveled. The first and most important shift was in her light exposure. Aging eyes don't absorb light the same way, and without strong daylight cues, the brain's master clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, drifts out of sync. Martha began stepping outside within 30 minutes of waking, even if just to sit. Morning light, rich in blue spectrum wavelengths, reset her circadian rhythm and helped anchor her body in time. Then came her evening ritual. Instead of screens and overhead lights, she switched to low amber bulbs and soft instrumental music after 8 p.m. She avoided scrolling, heavy conversations, and overstimulation, allowing her nervous system to downshift naturally. Her meals changed too. Gone were the late-night snacks and sugar-rich desserts. Dinner became lighter, cleaner, protein-based. No starches after 6. Sometimes she took a spoonful of almond butter or a magnesium glycinate capsule to prevent blood sugar drops, subtle, targeted supports for a more stable night. She also reviewed her medications with her doctor, shifting them earlier in the day and removing ones that quietly interfered with melatonin and REM cycles. It took time, but it made a difference. One surprising addition was her attention to minerals, especially magnesium, potassium, and trace electrolytes. Seniors often become slightly deficient over time, especially with common blood pressure meds or diuretics. These minerals play a vital role in muscle relaxation, electrical signaling, and adrenal support. On the nights she remembered her mineral-rich broth or took a warm Epsom salt bath, her sleep felt heavier, deeper. And then, there was the emotional piece. Martha kept writing. Not every night. Not always something profound. But enough to unburden the mind. Enough to make room for silence. In doing so, she noticed the vigilance faded. Her nervous system no longer clung to the early hours like it was bracing for something. She wasn't surviving the night anymore. She was sleeping through it. Her journal's final entry on the 3 a.m. phenomenon simply read, "I think my body trusts me again." For so many older adults, the mystery of waking up in the middle of the night isn't a flaw, it's a signal. One that points to an imbalance in rhythm, chemistry, or emotion. It's not about chasing perfect sleep, but about gently realigning the system so it doesn't feel the need to wake. Because when the body feels safe, when the blood sugar is steady, when the liver rests quietly, and the mind releases its grip, that's when the nights become whole again. And the hour once filled with mystery, that quiet space between 3 and 4, returns to what it was always meant to be. Just another part of the night. Unnoticed. Peaceful. And finally still. If you've ever lived through something like this, please consider leaving a comment in the comments section. You might be the person whose experience helps another viewer realize they're not alone. A single comment from you could be the reason someone else decides to speak up or become alert about their health. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so that you are notified when our next video is live. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video.